This is the Skeptics Panel. We're going to do 20 minutes, and then my response, and then open Q&A. I think that'll leave us lots of time for discussion, which will be great. So our first speaker today is Michael VEBER, and he is speaking on Sign Up or Get Out, How the HXA Way Undermines Open Inquiry and Viewpoint Diversity. And he is Associate Professor of Philosophy from East Carolina University. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and good morning. I first heard of this organization upon reading an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education where Jason Stanley, a very famous philosophy professor, referred to Heterodox Academy as a, quote, scaremongering rage machine. So I read that and said, hold on, how do I join? Turns out you join by filling out some forms online and checking this box that says that you support open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in research and education. In other words, you have to take a loyalty oath. And I thought, well, that's surprising, given that loyalty oaths have this long and dishonorable history in American academia. We're familiar with these diversity statements, mandatory for various jobs, going back further to the McCarthy-era declarations that you had to sign swearing you were not a commie to keep your job at a university. There was one at the University of California system in 1949 that didn't explicitly say you weren't a commie, but everybody took it to mean that. And Governor Earl Warren objected to that. That was the inspiration of the title. It was called came to be called the Sign or Get Out Ultimatum. Warren objected on the grounds that this was an oath that any communist would take and then laugh about it. So same thing here. I wonder what the point of this is. If the point is to filter out the woke spies who might infiltrate and gather dirt and cancel all the freethinkers, I don't think it's going to work. But whatever the point is, I have other beefs with it that you'll hear in a second. Now, I know what open inquiry and viewpoint diversity are, but one of the reasons why I paused here, in addition to my usual aversions to loyalty oaths, I don't know what constructive disagreement means. But thankfully, this is explained in this document called The Heterodox Way. Depending on what you want to do with the organization, you might have to take another oath swearing allegiance to this. And I'm going to zero in now on number 4, be constructive. Okay, so I want to have an open mind here. Let's, see what this says. Let's see if I agree with this or not. The objective of most intellectual exchanges should not be to win, but rather to have all parties come away from an encounter with a deeper understanding of ourselves. Okay, already, I hate this. Whenever I see a philosophical dispute or disagreement, I want to see people trying to win. I like my philosophy aggressive and combative and even hostile, and I think there's good reasons for this, which I'll get to in a bit. I also think it's more fun, and I'm not the only one who thinks this. Friedrich Nietzsche said one of the reasons why Socrates was so popular among the highborn youth of Athens was that he introduced them to a new kind of competitive wrestling. And this is important to me because this is something that comes up in my field. Once in a while, I'll hear a colleague complain that the relatively low numbers of women in philosophy is due to them being turned off by how aggressively pugnacious our discussions and debates can be. And so the thought goes that academic philosophers should abandon this fisticuffs model and replace it with something more polite and cooperative and collaborative and therefore woman-friendly. I disagree with that. I actually think it's the people who think that way are the ones who are being sexist. Look at it this way. Socratic dialectic is really the only combat blood sport where the women can and regularly do dominate the men at the very highest levels. And so I think in the interest of inclusivity, we have an obligation to protect and preserve the ancient combative and epistemically violent model of philosophical discussion and debate. Now take a look down there at the end. Do not analogize people to Stalin, Hitler, the Nazis. Now when I first read this, I was immediately reminded of the time one of my colleagues told the dean to his face that he was behaving just like Ceausescu. And not long after that, 3 faculty positions were stripped from the philosophy department, which I'm sure is just a coincidence. But when I read this, I thought, oh, I wish I could have seen this earlier, because perhaps I could have explained to the dean that one of the world's leading diversity groups has effectively said, you'll notice Ceausescu, brutal dictator, apparently a bit of an underachiever, didn't make the list. So we're saying here that Ceausescu comparisons are fine. Oh wait, there's an etc. on the end. Now that's reasonable, I think. I believe it was John Stuart Mill who, in Chapter 2 of On Liberty, said that if you want to preserve freedom of expression in the search for truth, you'll need an open-ended and therefore infinite and therefore infinitely abusable list of prohibited words and phrases. And let's not forget the wise words of Justice Brandeis, who said, the remedy for bad speech is to make every member of society swear to a speech code that can be enforced from above. You'll notice here, if you look towards the middle, that I've now run afoul of the policy prohibiting sarcasm. Oops. Looking further, if you want to join one of these communities, some more oaths you have to take, the way again. And then there's this policy on ad hominems, right, which is also sort of already contained in the be constructive. Another thing I take issue with, it says, don't attribute negative motives to people as a means of discrediting their views. I don't agree with that. I mean, if I've published a paper that says the MMR vaccine causes autism, and you point out that my study was funded by a personal injury lawyer who's currently suing the MMR vaccine manufacturer, and that I hold a patent on an alternative vaccine, and that I failed to disclose all this stuff, you are thereby attributing negative motives to me as a means of discrediting my view. And if you're right about all that, that's what you ought to be doing. Just don't do it around here. Unless you want to earn a demerit on your permanent record, ad hominem attacks and threats will not be tolerated. One offense will receive a warning. A second offense will result in removal from the group. Ooh. Members may report posts to the admins if they feel they have violated this policy. Well, I don't agree with this either. I think ad hominem arguments are fallacious, but only if they're irrelevant. Only if they're failures of relevance, and that's not always the case. Here again, Nietzsche's discussion of Socrates is instructive. This is where he calls the Pied Piper of Athens an ugly, sick, decadent, pseudo-Greek clown. But the context is, you see, as presented by Plato and the subsequent history of philosophy, and in one of the presentations last night, Socrates is like the ideal philosopher, and according to Plato, the philosopher is the ideal human being, the only one fit to be king. So Nietzsche's attacks on Socrates, the man, are attacks on the Socratic philosophy, and therefore not irrelevant. Since relevance is highly contextual and itself subject to disagreement, sometimes it's hard to tell whether an ad hominem is fallacious. Arthur Schopenhauer once called his colleague Hegel a, quote, flat-headed, insipid, nauseating, illiterate charlatan who reached the pinnacle of audacity in scribbling together and dishing up the craziest, most mystifying nonsense. About a century and a half later, Karl Popper cites this remark as proof that Schopenhauer was, quote, a man of supreme integrity who cherished the truth above all else. Now, if you think the shape of Schopenhauer's, or the shape of Hegel's head is irrelevant to whether the absolute realizes itself against, what is the line? The absolute realizes itself throughout history. If you think the shape of Schopenhauer's head is irrelevant to that, I'd prefer you just tell that to Schopenhauer and Popper and whoever else agrees with that, rather than tattle to the admins And then we could just let the marketplace of ideas sort it out from there. Rule number 4 also instructs us not to just criticize, but to try to imagine ways of integrating strong parts of an interlocutor's position into your own. And this is connected to rule number 2. Be intellectually charitable. This rule tells us to always try to engage with the strongest form of a position one disagrees with, that is, steelman, rather than straw manning them. I disagree with this too. If you disagree with me, I'd prefer you just engage with what I actually said. The problem with straw manning is that it distorts what the person says in order to make it easier to refute. You can also distort by steel manning. To say you should always steel man me is to say everything I say should be filtered through your own opinion of what you think I ought to have said. But what I think and what you think I should think may be two very different things, especially if we're involved in some fundamental disagreement over some important matter. And after all, maybe you're the one who's out to lunch. So why not just listen to what I said and go after that? If I think I'm being mischaracterized, I can say so. If you think there's a better view in the neighborhood of mine that I ought to adopt, you can say that, and I can take it or leave it. I'm not saying don't steal man or don't obey the principle of charity, but if you want to do that, that ought to be your choice and not something demanded by the discussion hall monitors and their admin overlords. Now, although the be constructive injunction plainly prohibits some things, we should also note that it's peppered with weasel words and scare quotes. The objective of most discussions is not to quote unquote win. You should try to do this and generally avoid that, and so on. So earlier when I called rule number 4 a policy, and I said it prohibited sarcasm, that was a bit of hyperbole on my part. Hyperbole being another thing prohibited by the policy. So I take it in that light, though. Rule number 4 is not so much a rule as it is a vibe. And as I read it, it's a vibe primarily of personality. So this, to me, reads like a description of your typical polite and professional and non-threatening and civil and always wanting to be helpful academic. And so to check the box is to promise that you'll be like that, or at least you'll generally mostly try to avoid not being like that. So I think this is also a mistake, especially for people who value viewpoint diversity. When I read a philosophy paper that's written by someone I know, I often think, yeah, that's exactly what I'd expect a guy like that to say. Usually I mean that as an insult, but not always. The point is, our points of view will often be products of our personalities. And so monotony of personality makes for monotony of point of view. If everyone were prone to be constructive in this sense, I think fewer flowers would bloom, and the ones that did would be less hearty. There's a lovely book by Bernard Mandeville from 1705 called The Fable of the Bees. It includes this epic poem making the case for thinking that vices at the individual level, things like greed and pride and fickleness, promote ingenuity and trade and wealth. Here's a line from it. Thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. So I think that something similar is true in the realm of knowledge. I think individual vices are often necessary for the attainment of collective epistemic good. So I think the community of inquirers needs people who ignore bourgeois norms of politeness in dogmatically pushing a point, people who just criticize, people who don't conceal their contempt for what they think is stupid, people who are sarcastic, hyperbolic, people who are insulting, people who are willing to attack not just the proposition but the person. I can't imagine a Schopenhauer or a Nietzsche ever being devout adherents of the heterodox way, but if they were, I think the history of ideas would be far worse and far duller for it. Now, whether I'm right or wrong about all that stuff I just said is ultimately a philosophical matter, and that really gets to the heart of it, I think. So by requiring this little loyalty oath here, Heterodox Academy is sort of pressuring people into endorsing and adhering to a set of controversial and, in my view, false views about how people ought to go about inquiring and disagreeing with each other. So it looks like the society that claims to promote open inquiry and viewpoint diversity actually wants to regulate inquiry, and it demands uniformity of opinion on certain key philosophical questions. And I think a nice way to underline this is to check out the fee structure for the conference that we're participating in here. Call your attention to the upper left there. So you have a member and a non-member fee. So if, like me, you want to participate in the conference, but you have disagreements, you have a different point of view, a diverse point of view, I might even say, on certain issues involving constructive disagreement, involving the ad hominem argument, involving the principle of charity, and so on. The society that promotes viewpoint diversity will effectively fine you $100. I could have gone to the hotel bar and had 2 rum and cokes for that. So that, I think, underlines it. But let me close it out here. Let's look down to the bottom of the heterodox way here, right under rule number 5. Be yourself. You'll notice that they have helpfully translated the heterodox way into several other languages. I think that's very impressive. That brings a level of gravitas to things. That says this is a worldwide movement. That little logo, the one with the X in the middle, we expect to see that all over the globe, and we expect the heterodox way to be, the way it's done everywhere. That reminds me of something. What is it that I'm thinking of? Oh yeah, it's this. If, like me, this is a little document from back in '33. If, like me, your German is schlecht, you'll notice down at the bottom there that they've helpfully translated it into several other languages, which I'm sure is just a coincidence. This is the vow of allegiance of the professors of the German universities and high schools to Adolf Hitler and the National Socialistic State. My point is, making every member of your society swear that they will not draw unfavorable comparisons between their intellectual opponents and the Nazis is like something a Nazi would do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Our next speaker is IRFAN KHAWAJA, and he is formerly Associate Professor of Philosophy from Felician University and currently Provider Support Associate at CorroHealth, LLC. And he's speaking on Kalven's Complicit Executioners, a critique of the Kalven Committee report. Thank you.
So I should preface my remarks by saying that I do not speak for CorroHealth or vice versa, but thank you for being here. My title is Kalven's Complicit Executioners, a critique of the Kalven Committee report. And the Kalven Committee report is the locus classicus of the doctrine of institutional neutrality, which might be characterized as the claim that there should be an institutional policy of abstinence with respect to the adoption of a public corporate position on matters of public controversy. So there's been a revival of institutional neutrality on American college campuses and a widespread call for its further adoption. I believe there are now 157 institutions endorsing institutional neutrality as of the current date. So my thesis is that even if you grant the validity and soundness of the argument of the Kalven Committee report, it fails through the omission of a salient issue. So focus on matters of internal university governance and take the set of such matters that are matters of public controversy, and then take the subset of those matters that involve issues of complicity, that is, indictments of the university for its complicity in some wrongdoing. My claim is there are 2 defects here, glaring defects. One is that the Kalven Committee report fails altogether to deal with cases of this kind. And the other is that as a practical matter, the Kalven Committee report, in fact, provides a de facto blueprint for the evasion of claims about institutional accountability in cases of this description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a sola scriptura reading of the Kalven Committee report. So in this respect, my view is a lot like Michael's, which is to say I'm neither going to steelman it nor strawman it, but give a textually faithful account of what it says. So I read the text for what it actually says, not what it could have said or should have said, or for later emendations, interpolations, or commentary or addenda. Now, someone might say that the text is highly indeterminate, and so this isn't a fair thing to do, but it seems to me that that points to a signal defect in the text, namely its indeterminacy. This is a text that was meant to solve a problem, and my view is it doesn't do so. Now, the main thesis of the Kalven Committee report is that because the university's mission is teaching and research in the service of the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge, that mission requires the maximization of intellectual diversity, which in turn requires discursive neutrality at the institutional level. So despite some confusion about what the text says, fundamentally the text governs what the university says, not what it does. So it's a discursive requirement, not a practical one. Now, there are two addenda to the main thesis, which I call the self-defense exception and the operational proviso. The self-defense exception is an exception to the rule that I've just enunciated, whereas the operational proviso is not an exception, but rather an elaboration or a description of what I regard as a fairly obvious fact. So the self-defense exception holds that when the university is threatened by an external threat, when it faces an external threat of some kind, it has an obligation to rise to its own defense. And this is an exception because in this case, it doesn't have to be neutral in its public pronouncements about a matter of public controversy. The operational proviso holds that the university must of necessity act in a corporate fashion in its standard operating procedures. Now, I take this to be a proviso rather than an exception because it doesn't govern what the university says in a corporate fashion, but what it does. And just to remind you of the kinds of things that this operational proviso might govern, this is my list, but I think it's a fairly uncontroversial list of the kinds of things that universities do in a corporate fashion. Investment, budgeting, construction, personnel matters, curriculum adoption, enrollment management, facilities management, security, lobbying, legal matters, contractual negotiations, partnerships, discharge of ownership obligations, and PR. Not an exhaustive list. So that's the kind of thing that they do where no one thinks that what they're doing is done in a neutral fashion. Not the Kalven Committee report and not anyone who's spent time in higher education. Now, my claim was that the Kalven Committee report fails to deal with the issue of complicity. And in fact, the Kalven Committee report was intended to respond to an objection, an accusation of complicity leveled at the University of Chicago by SDS, namely that the University of Chicago was complicit in apartheid due to its investments in apartheid South Africa. Now, there is a common structure to claims, accusations about complicity, which I've identified or isolated in the following way. They involve, to my mind, 7 distinct claims. First of all, that some evil is taking place somewhere. Second, that the university is enabling, facilitating, or endorsing this evil. Third, that it's in doing so, it's entangling others in the same evil. Right? So the administration that's responsible for policy is complicit, whereas other people are being drawn in and entangled. Enablement, facilitation, and endorsement of evil is complicity, and entangling others is subordination in that complicity. Now, as moral agents, we have a moral duty to avoid both complicity and subordination, so the university should reverse its complicity in the case at hand. So the claims that I make here, I think, involve the claims implicit in the accusation involve, to my mind, fairly uncontroversial claims. And people could disagree about that, but I don't think that any deep and profound claims about complicity are required to make sense of the basic objection. So the assumptions being made about complicity are the following. First, it's plausible that evils are taking place. Second, that universities can be demonstrably complicit in them. That is, we don't need to settle on some particular case of complicity in order to ask that someone defending a thesis like the Kalven Committee report deal with the possibility of complicity, which it does not do. So that universities can be demonstrably complicit in evils, that universities can suborn the entanglement of others in that complicity, that moral agents have a duty, when feasible, to avoid clear complicity or entanglement in the most egregious of evils, that corporate entities inherit some of the moral duties of the agents who run them or are members of them, that universities are corporate entities run by moral agents, and that universities inherit the moral duty, when feasible, to avoid clear complicity and entanglement in the most egregious evils. Those are the basic presuppositions of this common structure of complicity. So some red herrings to avoid. The assumptions I've just identified on the previous slide do not require universities to go sailing the seven seas to make pronouncements on random social justice crusades. So I identified at the outset the kinds of cases I have in mind, and they're all cases where the university is already engaged in some course of action of which complicity is an accusation. I don't think I need a worked out theory of, or anyone making this accusation needs a worked out theory of complicity about its nature or our duty to avoid it. It's not that I don't have views on that. It's that in order to make the accusation or the criticism of the Kalven Committee report that I'm making, we don't need a whole theory of complicity to point out that it doesn't deal with complicity at all. I don't need the claim that some particular accusation of complicity was or is true or false. The claim is more general than that. And I don't need to endorse or condemn any particular activist tactic, disruptions, sit-ins, et cetera. That's a separate issue. The question is entirely general. Does the report handle true accusations of institutional complicity in grave evil on the assumption that such cases are possible? And my claim is it does not. Now, how does the main thesis apply to an accusation of complicity in the case where the accusation happens to be true? Suppose a true accusation of complicity is made on the assumption that this is possible, and it's a matter of public controversy. Well, institutional neutrality entails that the institution forswear comment on matters of public controversy, and this is one of them. So none of the 7 assumptions, or none of the 7 claims involved in the structure of claims about complicity is fair game for discussion, public discussion. Now, the institution may recognize that it is complicit and covertly seek to rectify this complicity, but it has to be covert. That is, even if it were to create a committee tasked with dealing with the rectification of the complicity, the people on the committee would have to be under a kind of gag order. They could not discuss the matter publicly. And the university could, with equal consistency, decline to rectify the complicity. There's nothing about institutional neutrality that requires rectification of any complicity of any kind. Complicity is not discussed at all. What about the self-defense exception? Well, the self-defense exception implies that the institution can defend itself against an accusation of any kind, including this one. So the university can either enact the self-defense exception by giving a substantive response or a procedural one. But either way, there's a problem. Suppose that it gives a substantive response to an accusation of complicity. Well, a first problem, not easily noticed, but obvious when you think about it, is that the exception implies defense. So it can't be invoked to allocute to a true accusation. Pause on that for a second, because it's extraordinary. If the accusation is true, the Kalven Committee report requires that the university not say anything, that it in effect take the fifth in a case where it's not under arrest. If the accusation is true and acknowledged as true, the exception becomes irrelevant. Now, it could substantively deny the accusation. Many accusations may be false. Maybe there's no evil. Maybe there's no complicity. Maybe the complicity is attenuated. Maybe there's any number of such claims. But the problem in this case is, yes, the self-defense exception is an exception, but in this case, the exception would swallow the rule. If an accusation is made and the university substantively engages the accusation, it's doing exactly what the Kalven Committee report is telling it not to do in the name of an exception. But then this is really not an exception. It just guts the doctrine altogether. Now, the university could take a procedural line. That is, it could forget the substantive content of the objection and make procedural objections like, well, activists are violating time, manner, and place restrictions, or it could, in fact, accuse activists or faculty members, whoever is bringing up the accusation, of violating institutional neutrality by bringing up the accusation, right? It could say the default rule that applies at the university is institutional neutrality. In a case where you're making an accusation that demands that we violate institutional neutrality, you yourself are violating it. You're demanding of us that we do something that violates the principles of the university, and that's in effect to blow up the university. It's in effect to violate the conditions that make the university's smooth operation possible. So advocates of institutional neutrality often act as though institutional neutrality involves no censorship, but this doesn't seem to me to be the case at all. If you are a faculty member who consistently brings up this kind of issue at a faculty meeting, you are quickly going to be called into the provost's office and told to stop. I can tell you that from personal experience. Someone is going to give you a call and say, show up in my office, stop doing this. I don't think there's any clearer case of chilled speech. But in any case, the procedural response is an evasion of the underlying moral issue. So that in this case, what institutional neutrality does is it protects academic freedom by proscribing corporate-level public deliberation over matters of institutional accountability. It rules out or neutralizes self-governance with respect to the matter that I identified at the beginning. Now, what about the operational proviso? Fundamentally, the operational proviso acknowledges a truism that the university can't engage in corporate action from a neutral perspective, but must act from institutional self-interest. Now, it acknowledges that institutional self-interest can conflict with morality and then offers up this highly contested claim. When it does, when there is this conflict, a careful assessment of the consequences is required, and there's this abrupt stop in the text after it says that. Now, many people have argued to me, pushed back on my thesis by claiming that this is the key text that deals with complicity. No, it is not. The careful assessment clause is a vacuity. The clause makes no reference to complicity, whether implicit or explicit. The clause asserts no obligation to adhere to any value, paramount or otherwise. Careful assessment can be carried out indefinitely without ever leading to a verdict. Careful assessment is compatible with total opacity in speech and action. No plausible construal of careful assessment says or implies that universities should ever respond to public accusations of complicity with candor or alacrity. Indeed, any such construal would subvert the whole point of the report. So here is what I take to be the crux. Institutional neutrality at the University of Chicago was a response to the campus left. Believe it or not, I do not regard myself as a member of the left. The problem that I see here is that the response that the report gives undercuts all accusations of complicity by omission and evasion. It treats complicity as a taboo subject, so that institutional neutrality is an attack on the very idea of moral accountability at the institutional level. It presupposes a zero-sum game between academic freedom and institutional accountability. What it says, in effect, is that if you're going to preserve the conditions of academic freedom, you can't demand that an administration respond publicly to an accusation of complicity regardless of its scope and regardless of the turpitude of the evil involved. And I would ask, what is the argument for this zero-sum conception? So I have made my way through a fair bit of the discussion, the literature on institutional neutrality. I haven't seen anything that looks like a reasonable argument. Now, is my title inflammatory? It is, of course, an allusion to Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Okay, well, here is a challenge to the advocates of the Kalven Committee report version of institutional neutrality. Take a university invested in Auschwitz, including Dr. Mengele's lab. Now activists get some prima facie evidence that this is taking place, so they demand divestment where the demand is controversial. So it may be uncontroversial that Auschwitz is evil, but it may still be controversial that we do something about it. The university publicly declines to discuss the issue. Internally, the university has deliberations that it doesn't disclose to anybody else, and it cites declining enrollment, fiduciary responsibilities, high return on investment as a reason for leaving its investments in place. What part of this does Kalven-style institutional neutrality rule out? And my answer is none. None. So It may sound inflammatory, it may sound like an exaggeration, but I think of institutional neutrality as the banality of evil refurbished for academic life today. It is a way of giving bureaucracies the ultimate in non-accountability. No disclosure, no claims, no responses to accusations, no uptake. They can simply take the fifth as though they were under arrest when they're not. And that seems to me a deeply defective view of academic life and indeed of bureaucratic life, of the way any bureaucracy should function. Bureaucracies, whether academic or otherwise, should have some kind of responsiveness to this kind of accusation. But in this case, the institutional neutrality guarantees that there won't be. Thank you.
Thank you for those really fascinating, provocative, and really interesting papers. I'm Alice DREGER. I'm the managing editor and senior scholar, which I think just means I have trifocals, for Heterodox Academy. And, you know, it's funny that they asked me to be the respondent to this, because out of all the staff at Heterodox Academy, I think I am absolutely the snarkiest. And sometimes I wonder to myself whether they asked me to do this because they knew I would have to follow the HXA way and behave myself, and that maybe I would learn to follow the HXA way. And in that sense, it also occurred to me that maybe part of why we have the HXA way is to encourage people who are smart and influential to be a little more effective. And I do find, actually, that when I'm following that, I end up being a little more effective. So I'm going to try to leave my snark out, even though, as Michael noted, it's way more fun. And, you know, I grew up on Long Island, which means that whatever snarkiness I did not get genetically endowed to me, I developed culturally. So it is really challenging not to engage in something where you want to win. I'm also highly competitive. My spouse points out that I'm the only person who ever played Candyland with their child and tried to win over and over again. So I get it. I get where Mike is coming from, certainly. My degree is, by the way, is in history and philosophy of science. So half of my time was spent with philosophers fighting with each other, which I enjoyed immensely. And yet, we're in this situation as an organization and as a culture where we are faced with the problem of trying to change universities that are pretty intransigent and at the same time have become highly corporatized and are therefore even less likely to be responsive to academic pleas. And in that situation, I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to fix the problems that we see. And in that way, I think the two papers that we've heard from help us get towards that. One of the things I want to emphasize is Heterodox Academy is open to criticism and open to change. That's kind of why we're here. So I want to encourage Mike and anyone else who sees problems with the way that we approach things to absolutely bring it to us so that we can make the situations better. With regard to steel manning arguments, it's not actually that you're supposed to fix the argument of the other person. You're actually supposed to take the strongest points of their argument. So I'll try to do this as I respond. But I have to say, even while I say that, seeing on screen the HXA way, I started noticing things about it that I had never noticed before. For example, number 5, where it says be yourself, it doesn't actually describe being yourself. It actually says you should stand up and fight stupidity, which is not necessarily the same as being yourself. So we have work to do on this, and we really welcome the criticisms. And one of the wonderful things about having our membership is that we can turn to them and rely on them to help. So we may also turn to people who choose not to be members. However, members are sort of within easy arm's reach. So that's one of the reasons we do ask people to join. By the way, joining doesn't cost anything financially. It is true that we ask you to support or affirm some values. That's chiefly because we want to make sure you're in the right room. We want to make sure that when you're with us, you understand the main things we're working on. It's quite easy to read about something, perhaps that we're, I forget what it was, a scaremongering horror show. And if you come to us and you think that's what we are, you're in the wrong place. That isn't what we are. So in many ways, where we ask you to join for membership and affirm our basic values, which are open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement, is an attempt to make sure you know you're in the right room. And we have an extraordinarily diverse membership, which thrills me all the time. As I said yesterday, one of the things that happens at HXA conferences that never happens in any other academic conference for me is I never know what I'm going to hear, and as a consequence, extraordinarily, I never know what I'm going to think. In most academic settings, I know already what I'm going to think. I may learn a few things, but I know how I'm going to think. But at HXA, we actually can change how it is we think. So, is it a loyalty oath? I don't think that what we're asking you to sign up for is a loyalty oath. Loyalty oaths are certainly problematic. I agree with Mike on that. Ways in which DEI statements for hiring, for example, and promotion have been used effectively as loyalty oaths, requiring people to adhere to a particular political point of view, sometimes in extraordinary detail in terms of what you must profess to believe. And those are really, really problematic. But we are not asking you to be loyal to an institution or necessarily a specific political point of view. We are explicitly nonpartisan. If what we're asking you to do is to be loyal to open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement, then I suppose it is a loyalty oath. But again, it's a question of, are you in the right room? We have very little power over your lives, unlike your university, which has quite a lot of power over your lives. I, for example, resigned my position at Northwestern because I was censored by my dean, and I did not have the power to overturn that censorship. With something like HXA, we don't have that kind of power, so we welcome people to join us basically in the mission. Mike brought up the idea that politeness can cover up problems. I absolutely agree. And this is something I really struggle with, is the question of how to be polite to the point where I don't lose my integrity. And again, I'm a New Yorker, and I've lived in the Midwest for 30 years, so I really struggle with this all the time. In fact, I end up being tapped in my neighborhood as the person who has to say the things somebody doesn't want to hear. People literally come to me and say, can you tell this neighbor that they can't leave the dog barking all the time? Can you call the police and tell them the student house of renters is driving us all crazy? Can you please always be the bad guy? And actually, I'm fine with that, because I'm not worried about it, and I do it. In fact, I ended up starting a newspaper for the people of East Lansing for this very reason, because it was a one-party, totally blue town. I am left of center, but I don't like one-party towns. Totally blue town, and no one was willing to be impolite enough to speak the truth about what was going on at our city council. So I often say if I ever write a memoir about those 10 years of running a local news investigative system within our town, it will begin, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a Midwestern one-party town without a newspaper is in need of a New Yorker. It is a difficult question when we give up politeness in order to fight harder than you can fight when you're being polite. But I do think often we are more effective when we can find ways to engage people where they are and address them in a way that doesn't get their stress hormones up too far. Sometimes getting people's stress hormones up actually makes them sort of meat tenderized, and it makes them able to absorb the marinade better, but not always. And so that's part of what we're dealing with. And the more we're dealing with the corporate culture of academia, the more the people above us are MBAs and not PhDs, the more we have to deal with the fact that they are not of our culture in philosophy. They are, in fact, of a different culture. And there is a cultural problem there that we have to get cross-culturally proficient to talk with them in a way that can actually change their minds. I worked in the intersex rights movement for about 20 years, and it took me too long to realize that the way you actually change people, in this case, the people I was trying to change was pediatric surgeons and pediatric endocrinologists, the way you change people is through relationships. That's how you really get work done, is through relationships. And that's part of how HXA is moving forward to do this kind of change work in our universities, is through the relationships those of you already have at your universities. It is through our members that we are able to affect change at universities. So again, one of the things that is difficult, if you're trying to win an argument all the time, the only people you're really going to make friends with is New Yorkers and philosophers. And you're going to have to make friends with more people than that to do that kind of work. We're trying to change not only the policies in universities, but to actually change the culture. In fact, the change in the policies is only because we want to change the culture. The reason we want something like institutional neutrality is to create a culture that actually allows our faculty and our students to be more free. It's not that we care about institutional neutrality for its own sake. We care about it because of the culture. Ultimately, we're trying to change hearts and minds. If we don't do that, what we see is things like DEI simply getting a new name, right? And being used in a way, again, that's going to require people to take a particular loyalty oath. It may be then become a right of center loyalty oath, but it will be just as problematic. So what we want to do is really reorient people's hearts and minds on campuses, all the way from the bottom, all the way to the top, to this vision where we have the culture that John Tomasi was describing yesterday, where people are really free to go where their minds need to go. With regard to the Kalven report, I thought IRFAN's critique of it is really, really interesting, and it suggests that there's work to do again. Many universities that have adopted the Kalven report, and by the way, at HXA we have a really great report out on what the last year of adoptions that does some really fine analysis from our research department led by Alex Arnold. Many universities that are adopting versions of institutional neutrality are not simply adopting the Kalven report, they're inventing their own, and that's for good and for bad. So it's very important at your own university to look very carefully at what's actually happening within that policy. And Alex has done a lot of work for us with regard to institutional neutrality, some of it at our Substack blog, Free the Inquiry. So if you go to our Substack to Free the Inquiry and search institutional neutrality, you'll find a lot of really great blogs that Alex has written that actually parse out how does this work in practice. Some universities are choosing to do restraint, for example, instead of calling it institutional neutrality. But it's very important that you pay attention to exactly what's going on, including for the reasons that IRFAN pointed out, which is that we do not actually want a system where institutional neutrality is the banality of evil refurbished for academic life. I mean, as a historian, that's a really chilling possibility, and I recognize that. The road to hell is absolutely paved with good intentions, and the adoption of institutional neutrality is not always even coming out of good intentions. Sometimes it is, in fact, I think, coming out of a desire to simply get out of a sticky situation on the part of the administration. But I thought carefully about what would be a case, for example, a specific case, not maybe a case thinking of Auschwitz and Dr. Mengele, but a real contemporary case where you might get this situation where a policy of restraint would cause a university to avoid actually critiquing itself. And the case that came to mind is one I had to live with, which was the case of Larry Nassar. At Michigan State University. So Larry Nassar was the sex abuser who abused hundreds of girls and women under the guise of providing medical care. By way of disclosure, so I worked at Michigan State during that period. My spouse is now the dean of the medical school at Michigan State, and I was running a newspaper when this was all breaking, so we were dealing with some of it. And girls at our high school were some of his victims. In that case, would institutional neutrality have prevented Michigan State from owning what had happened, which had been the case of there had in fact been complaints against him and no one took them very seriously because he was powerful and he was connected to a very powerful dean within the system. I don't think that the policy of institutional neutrality, as has been adopted today, would prevent Michigan State from having to reconcile, in fact, with what it had done. I think if that's the way it gets interpreted, that that's a problematic interpretation of how it works. But I don't think that Kalven requires that the university only speak when it's defending itself. It really speaks to the idea, at least in most of the institutional neutrality policies I've looked at, the university can speak whenever it is in a situation where something is directly implicating its mission. And in this case, there is no question it directly implicated the mission of the university because it was implicating what was happening structurally within the university in terms of providing safety. It does, however, speak to the fact that not everything a university does is search for knowledge. Some of what universities do is provide health care. That's part of the mission of a university that provides a healthcare system. And in that case, they had a duty, obviously, to address what was going on. And it was not a pretty scene in terms of how that was worked out, especially because people were understandably being arrested. So as we go forward and we're thinking about what to do in Heterodox Academy in terms of working with our members to try to affect this local change, John Tomasi mentioned yesterday that we're moving from trying to activate campus contras to really activate principled allies. And I really love that phrase. The first time he used it in a staff meeting, I thought, wow, that really captures, I think, where we need to go. Campus contras have had a strong usefulness, but they didn't manage to change the university system. That has not been very effective in a lot of ways. We are at a moment where we have a window that has opened, and it doesn't seem like the window will be open for very long. In fact, I have said over and over again in staff meetings, we need to prepare for the possibility of a blue wave in 2026 because this could shut down a lot of what it is we're trying to do. So we have to be perpetually prepared in that way. But I think if we think about it, using the principled allied approach is going to be the most effective way for us to activate our members and help them work with their university administrations to change the campus cultures. And again, where we're changing policy because culture is what we care about. At the end of the day, it may be the case that the reason you don't say something or don't do something or don't teach something is because of a policy. But the policy in many ways is a product of culture, and it is what helps to establish a culture. And culture is what we ultimately care about in terms of being able to move forward and establish better spaces for people to do the kinds of challenging work they want to do and to change their minds and to change their students' minds, or to, even more ideally, get their students' minds to work in a way that their students' minds are always open to the possibility of change. So I'm just going to stop there and invite folks to ask questions of any individual or of the whole panel. Thank you. Oh, good. Is that working? Great. Okay, so I'll just stay at this mic. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Good talks, both of you. I wanted to ask about Mike's idea of winning an argument and your response that we're maybe more winsome when we try not to win, in a sense. Is it the case that you should never try to win? And if not, should we not make that one of the requirements for being constructive, as was Mike was showing on the screen?
You know, coincidentally, someone who's is a supporter of Heterodox Academy, he's not an academic, but he's a lover of philosophy of science, who sent me this wonderful piece he wrote years ago, responding to a friend who had questions about what science is. He was talking about the fact that a theory is something you're always working to disprove or find evidence for, but that you're not sort of trying to win your theory. And I think that's part of why it is we try to support constructive disagreement rather than just simply disagreement. The idea of viewpoint diversity is not just that everybody's allowed to be in the room, although that's nice. The point of viewpoint diversity, and Musa al-Ghabari has written about this beautifully in many places, but including in the first issue of Inquisitive, which I got to edit, he talks about the fact that viewpoint diversity helps us get to better knowledge, right? And we know this from the history of science, that when you are able to get more people thinking on a problem, you get a better answer. American democracy was founded on the same principle, which is more minds gets you a better outcome in terms of the leadership of a country. So you know, sometimes do we want to have a game where intellectually one side is trying to win over the other? I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think HXA would ever say we shouldn't do that. I think what HXA is saying is that what we're trying to do in our work is to get to someplace better as a collective and to work together to try to get to that place.
Can I throw in real quick on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, notice winning was in quotation marks. So it's don't try to win. So I really don't even know what it means. Does it mean something like, well, don't use bad arguments just to score points? Well, there again, you know, people do that all the time, but who's going to admit that they're doing it? If by winning you mean, you know, I'm going to make the strongest case I can, and if I'm making bad arguments, you can call me out on it. Well, I think that's fine. And if people want to approach it that way, that ought to be their call. But if they want to do this collaborative-y thing, that's fine too. That's what I take open inquiry to be. So that was, again, my point is that open inquiry and viewpoint diversity aren't really consistent with this constructive disagreement business for that sort of reason.
Could I add something here? So It does seem to me that it's often a matter of context. So there are some arguments where the issue is open-ended and there's not a matter of winning, but there are cases in which what you're trying to do is convince someone to do something, or the alternative is not to do that thing. So you have contrary possibilities, and the argument that wins is the argument that induces either the action or the omission. So I don't think it's possible to prescind from winning in cases like that. That is, cases where some kind of high-stakes action is at issue.
Thank you. Alex?
So, IRFAN, I really like the paper. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your theory of moral complicity. So, American citizen, I pay income tax. Roughly 15 to 20% of that income tax, federal income tax, goes to the Department of Defense. Supported by. I'd say roughly a non-trivial percentage of what the DoD does I find to be morally problematic. Right? And so, yeah, in the grand scheme of things, the few thousands of dollars that I pay in income tax goes to DoD. It's a drop in the bucket of an $800 billion entity. On the other hand, I am like buying hand grenades and hellfire missiles. Am I complicit? Are all of us in this room who pay taxes complicit? Well, let me just say real quick. Do I willingly pay my taxes? I mean, yeah, I let them withhold from my paycheck and then I pay whatever balance is due at the end of the year. I'd rather not. I actually love to be able to withhold from my withholding some money, but so, I mean, I'm actually just deeply interested in really trying to reason my way through a clearer sense of life. I mean, we're deeply entangled in this world in all sorts of things, right? So, you know, we're staying at this hotel. The hotel has bought factory farmed animals and has served them to us for dinner. What's it? Maybe. So I'd just love to hear you say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so it seems to me that a theory of complicity has to make a four-way distinction between the following. It has to distinguish primary wrongdoers from the complicit, from the non-culpably entangled, from the purely innocent. So in the case that you're describing, I say you're entangled. But if you were to invite the Department of Defense into your home and give them a plush room in your house and say, you can use this as you will, please give me a cut of rent, then you'd be complicit, right? So there's a case in which you have the option and you've done something that you didn't have to do, but you did it anyway. So it seems to me that universities are often trying to pretend that they're in the situation you've described when they're really in the situation I've described, where they have options but are pretending not to have them. And the primary means of pretense is non-disclosure. So you bring it up with them and they say, well, I'll talk to the hand. We can't discuss this because institutional neutrality requires that we remain mum on this kind of situation. And that's what I'm objecting to. So it's a difficult call to figure out when an institution or a person or whatever is complicit and when it's merely entangled, or whether it's the primary wrongdoer or whether it's totally innocent. But in a context in which institutional neutrality prevails, the discussion can't get off the ground. Because I have had this conversation with Princeton University, and I asked them point blank, I asked the administration point blank, and I got a written answer from the vice president of the university. I asked them, if you were given prima facie evidence of your complicity in some wrongdoing, would you allocute to the accusation? And their answer was, we would not discuss it at all.
Well, but was that because of institutional neutrality or because of liability risk?
They wouldn't say.
I'm thinking it's liability risk.
They wouldn't say.
Yeah. Some from this side, yes.
I'm wondering about the definition of evil in some sense, and your answer may be, well, that's not what my paper was about, and that's fair enough. But I'm curious, so that you brought this striking example of somebody being invested in Dr. Mengele's lab. I'm curious about cases where, I'm Jewish, and I'm almost hesitant to say, like, this is an obvious case of evil, though I personally think it very obviously is, because exactly of my question, which, you know, I know people who think that Hamas's attack on Israel was an ultimate act of justice, and I know people who think it was an ultimate act of evil. And so, in your first premise, universities could be complicit in something that's evil. It strikes me that what I like about institutional neutrality neutrality is that the university never has to say which one of my friends is right. And I'm wondering how you kind of think about when the definition of evil seems a little bit unclear, how that kind of plays into your views on institutional.
That's exactly why I object to it. So that's why I object to institutional neutrality. So in a case in which the university is already entangled in something, I think it has an obligation to weigh in on what it's doing. That's literally what's being asked of it. So if its claim is, well, we insist on remaining agnostic on the issue, we just don't know how to make a decision, then it should say that. If it has sufficient information to do better than that, then it should say that. But what it can't do is have this, by my lights, what it can't do is have this blanket policy about everything, which is to say, well, that's very controversial, we're not going to talk about it. Because that's not even a case of agnosticism. That's a case that's sort of like a meta-agnosticism about accountability as such. Mm-hmm. So in a case in which a university wants to say, well, we need to remain agnostic, I think one of the things that I would say is, look, you have the resource, you have resources of a kind that most institutions don't have, and you make pretenses that most institutions wouldn't. I work in the corporate sector. Nobody at CorroHealth gives a crap about complicity. We're all about revenue management, but that's not the way universities talk. So there's this breach between their sort of pretensions and how it is when you actually deal with the president of Princeton University or the president of any university and you say, look, your moral prestige is on the line here. You're doing X. What do you think about the doing of X? And the response is not even, well, I don't have enough information. It is, I don't talk about stuff like that. Well, that's illegitimate. So if that's the case, then you should drop all of the moral language that you engage in all of the time. But they can't do that. Their mission statements are full of this sort of elevated moral talk. Okay, drop the whole pretense. Just say that you're Machiavellian institutions that will do anything for money. But they can't even say that, because that would be controversial, right? So you just get involved in this kind of regress that never has resolution.
So it's a question of hypocrisy then. You can like do one all the way or do the other all the way, but what institutional neutrality does is put both.
As a start, yeah, it's hypocrisy.
Okay. Yes.
I was trying to imagine how one could have these three talks touch each other, and it seemed to me that your metaphor, Alice, of it's just knowing what room you're in. It sort of obscured the obvious authority that's being used to sort, at least speculatively. There are people out there who will not be let into Heterodox Academy. Mike comes off in his sort of liberating and funny kind of rejoinder is basically saying, you know, you shouldn't keep anybody out of the room. More the merrier. And it's sort of a grump in a comedy, you know, where there's a festival sort of summons based on diversity and a kind of pleasure. But it seems to me that IRFAN arguments, which are very nuanced and powerful, there's no such thing as neutrality. And that ignores the pragmatic reason that people began to point to Chicago, especially fire, to get people to have a policy of neutrality. It's that, you know, when you have a professional organization like ASEX, I was the president of, after you make one response, then everybody else in the organization has other responses, and pretty soon you can't clear the room and have a meeting. You don't have a sort of good enough unity to have a kind of discussion, and everyone says they want.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the challenge. I was thinking of the challenge of the moderators, for example, on the listservs that are, or the discussion boards that are part of HXA. I've had to be a moderator of, not these, but of other situations. And it is extremely difficult to figure out how to maintain a room where people can talk if one person takes over and is constantly bullying and pushing every little thing. You do end up self-censoring and people end up dropping off the list, and that's not what we want, right? We want people to remain engaged. So this is a trick, and again, I think HXA is open to suggestions on how to do it better, but it is a very difficult situation. I will point out, when HXA started, John Haidt called me at one point and said, I don't understand why you haven't joined HXA. And I said, because I quit my job over censorship, and therefore I'm ineligible because I don't have a university affiliation. So he created a Alice category and basically let me in. And that is, though, still one of the requirements of HXA membership, is that you have an affiliation of a particular type, or at least have a history of a particular type. And this is part of the challenge, is the question of who do you let in the room and not let in the room. If HXA were to say, we simply open our doors to anybody who wants to come into any discussion, into any meeting, we would quickly, I think, be swamped by people who are not academics, and the conversation is meant to be a conversation about academia, so by the people who are actually living it and who are in danger in it. So it's a trick.
Hey, I wanted to respond to the knowing what room you're in line as a response to what I said. I don't buy it because I think a simple mission statement would do that just fine. What you're being asked to do is check a box saying you agree with the rules of the room. And that's very different, especially if it's a society devoted to viewpoint diversity. Take, for instance, the sign out there that says, well, if you're in this room, you might be filmed, and we might put it on our thing and collect revenue for it or whatever. I don't like it, but I wasn't asked whether I like it, and I didn't have to support it. I knew what room I was in. Funny story, there's this little book called Galileo's Middle Finger, where the author tells a story about how she walked in to give a talk, and they had a sign like that up, and she made him take it down. So yeah, also, while we're on the subject, since the phrase was used again, I don't think much hinges on me using the phrase loyalty oath. That said, of course it's a loyalty oath. It's a political group that's trying to change the culture. Here's a bunch of principles that you have to accept as a condition of membership that somebody else wrote. You didn't write that, and as I showed, some of these are quite detailed and, in my opinion, false. Now, is that always a bad thing for a political group? No. If I have started the Society for the Advancement of Cigar Smoking, and I say, well, in order to be a member of the society, you have to agree that cigars are great and they should be available on demand, especially to children. That's not a society devoted to open inquiry and viewpoint diversity, right? And so that's where the problem.
So, Mike, would you be comfortable if, when you come to join, we had our mission and we said, you believe this, or do you want it just the mission and then people join
that would be better.
Well,
there's two things. It would be better if you just said, here's the mission. It's another, it introduces another problem, especially for viewpoint diversity. If you say you have to check this box saying you agree with our understanding of this, right? That's the difference with the filming rule. And that's a little like, I have this conversation with my students every semester, usually at the end when somebody hasn't come to class. And they say, well, I'm going to fail because you have this attendance policy. And I say, yeah, you sure are. And they say, well, I don't agree with attendance policies. I say, well, good. Doesn't matter. You're still going to be held to it. I never asked whether you agreed with it or not.
So I like that idea of perhaps just having the mission and just making sure people know they're in the right room. But just one more question. So when you...
But also I want to say a second thing. Though. I think the three things are incoherent. As constructive disagreement, as it's explained, as I showed, isn't consistent with open inquiry, as I understand it, because it's a bunch of rules on how to argue and how to go about inquiring with each other. And again, I have reasons for rejecting these rules.
Yeah, I think we could.
And I think, think of it this way, thought experiment. Suppose your university adopted the heterodox way and insisted that you follow that in your campus dealings. What would you say? Would you think that's okay? And I wouldn't. I wouldn't trust that at all.
So one possibility is to define more clearly open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement so that they're not in conflict. But just one more question. So when you agree to an app, user terms, is that a loyalty oath?
The app is not a political organization. And so
Really?
no.
Really?
Well, I guess it depends on the app.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what you're agreeing to is being held to those, too, right? So it depends on what it says. Does it say, I think these are good rules, or does it say, I understand that these are the things I'll be held to?
Yeah, one of the fundamental,
So signing a contract isn't always a loyalty oath. It's a way of saying, yes, I understand the contract. I don't agree with what you're charging me for car insurance, but
It's fun.
One of the funny things about HXA is that it's a group of non-joiners, right? By definition, it attracts people who don't want to be in a singular thing.
that's why I think that it's not going to work to explain these things more. You're just going to have more problems. You're just going to have more controversial stuff that I'm not going to like. Not that you want me.
I propose a conditionally entangled membership category.
I like it. Say it again, Mark.
Conditionally entangled.
Conditionally entangled. I like it. That would make a great T-shirt too.
Alice, could I respond to his
Yes,
question?
yes, absolutely. Thanks,
Never
Irfan.
responded to it.
Yes.
So let me just clarify your question. So your worry about the rejection of institutional neutrality is that it creates these kind of pragmatic problems, especially in the cases of sort of moderation with respect to an organization. Let me delimit that, because this is a problem with different ramifications, different contexts. But at the level of a university, where it is clear where the buck stops, that is, with the Board of Trustees and the C-suite, it seems to me that these are people, not the board, but the C-suite, that are getting paid the big bucks to make the kinds of decisions that you are alluding to. So in the case of a moderator, that's a voluntary position. I can understand how there's a pragmatic problem. But in the case of the president of a university, they're getting paid $1 million+ to make exactly the kinds of determinations that I am saying they must make and discuss, which is to say, when does an accusation rise to the level that they are obliged to respond, and when not? And when it does, and there are cases when it does, my view is they must respond, right? In the case of an Auschwitz, or in the case of apartheid South Africa, if the accusation is being made and is prima facie true, you cannot hide behind a doctrine that allows you indefinitely to hide, which is what institutional neutrality does. So that's my view. Now, how it applies to these sort of subunits of the academic enterprise is a separate issue that would take a long time to discuss. But at the highest level, I don't think it's that difficult.
Yes.
I just recently hosted our first Heterodox Academy at our campus at Waterloo in Canada. I'm an ex-American, an ex-Northeasterner, so probably in a good position to do that in polite Canada. But our group, yeah, we had a decent turnout for a not huge campus, and one person really insisted on Mike's approach, that we go all the way, and we allow the most painful discussions in Canada right now involve residential school graves, and we could go there first. The group decided we're not going to go there first. We're going to build it first, and then we're going to stress test it later. And one of my more brilliant, curmudgeonly, cantankerous colleagues flounced out of the room and said, F this isn't the heterodox way. And I'm sorry, maybe he isn't in the right room. I feel like we'll never get to the place where in my classrooms, which I can and do, introduce Alice's work or Sasha Lysova's work, and my students don't freak out. I can do that by practicing the heterodox way. So I don't know if it's just like bees with honey versus vinegar. I think we can make more progress if we make sure, at least out of the starting gate, people don't think we're whatever the terms used to describe HXA people.
Campus Contras, yes. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Right. I should say, if you choose to do that, well, fine. That's a little different from coercing people into following these rules while you're at the same time saying we're all about open inquiry, viewpoint, diversity. There's another way to look at it. If you look on the WAY website, you'll see that they encourage us all to follow these principles in our professional lives, and they insist that these rules be followed at their events, presumably including this one. One of the rules, remember, don't compare people to Nazis. Well,
You'll notice we didn't throw you out.
that's what I did. Oh, yeah,
We also gave you a platform here, as well as the USC Censorship and Science Conference.
That raises the question, so how is this a rule then?
I think that's a fair question.
You insist on? What are you going to do about it? Well, if it's nothing, then there is no rule. You could admit you're wrong and it's a bad rule. Sounds like that's not happening. Or you could throw me out, which you're not doing because you see, well, we want to allow open inquiry and so on.
Me.
And him, he had Eichmann
No,
in
I'm
the
not throwing you out
abstract.
because you have $100 extra, and that bar is expensive. So.
Yeah, so you can not have the rule. You can throw people out. I think, though, however you do it, I win.
We just have 4 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is actually call on everybody who wants to speak. So just keep your comments short. Avoid your preamble. Say what you want to say so that we can get everything else out on the table. Go ahead.
Just a quick comment. It seems to me that we're talking about two different things. We're talking about diversity of ideas, viewpoints, but also diversity of behaviors. And what I resent sometimes, and I've given a number of presentations for HXA. I come from I'm going to give a talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. I happen to be favorable to it in a different way. And I've had horrible comments that were made in the thing that, quite frankly, there was no room for in a civilized society. And to me, the problem is the behavior. So if you're going to be disruptive, you're going to be disruptive in a way that does not help anything, then to me, that's something that is not about diversity of viewpoint, that it does not, being able to have rules. And I would just suggest, maybe instead of saying you have to adhere to this, you could say these are the guidelines that we believe will make for better discourse.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you. Yes.
Just real quickly, you want to know groups who want to win, teach MBA students. So we have the biggest MBA program in the U.S. at Georgia State.
Mm-hmm.
I teach the core accounting course. They get me first, and they have to get through me to get on to all their other courses. And I teach them about the Chicago view, and then we talk about March, we talk about everything. But I am using Heterodox Academies, the Heterodox way, to help us relate, to help us talk, to help us appreciate each other's views, and I'm writing the first Heterodox Academy case.
I'm excited to see that. We talked about it yesterday, yeah.
So that's how we're using the Heterodox way.
Thank you. And by the way, we want your resources, so please be sharing them with us. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. As somebody who also recently joined, I had a lot of problems with the loyalty oath for many of the same reasons. I kind of wonder how many people he polled for membership actually think it's necessary to sign a loyalty oath. But a sort of second thing in the backdrop of what I've heard, and again, I don't know a lot of stuff, is it seems like sometimes there's a bifurcation of us-them thinking, and the us is sort of the heterodox way, but it's positioned against sort of DEI, some sort of conception of the university that, to call it a singular culture, I mean, that's a reductionist way of characterizing universities. There's incredible diversity. And it seems to me there's also sort of social engineering. So, where's the pushback against patriotic education as opposed to DEI?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's just another
Great comment. Thank you.
Yes.
And maybe we'll do that as our member poll this next coming month. I think that would be a really interesting member poll. I love that idea. Other comments or questions? Okay, either of you want to get some last words in? All right, we're going to have more time for coffee. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, guys.